So we're very happy that you were able to join. I think we'll have a good group here. Looks like some folks are still trickling in. And yeah, we'll go through, this is going to be a 2-hour session. So we'll go through the agenda here for what we have in mind for today. We'll provide an introduction here just in a minute and summarize for some of the for those of you who maybe weren't in our in-person grant training workshops over the last few months. We'll just touch on what we covered there. And then, as I mentioned, this session today is focused on grant budgeting. And so we'll set the stage here, why we're talking about grant budgeting, why it's important when you're delivering your grant application to have a really strong grant budget. And then the bulk of the session, we're going to kind of guide you through building your budget from the ground up. And so that's going to include really understanding your project's costs. And then as well, what the NOFO, we'll talk about that, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, what the grant program requirements are, and how to make sure that your budget aligns with all of those requirements. And then the last step there under number 3 is really having understood those 2 concepts, really preparing your budget proposal, what goes into that, and what are the best practices. We'll touch on some advanced budgeting topics as well, and then we hope to save some time for questions and answers. So before we introduce our team here who will be presenting today, if any of you are new to Teams formats, our Teams meeting today, well, what do we have? We've got 60 some people here, which is great. We do have a chat. So if you look at the top of your Teams window, you'll see a little speaker bubble that says chat. And if you click on that, this is a place where you can add some questions, and our team will be answering as many of those as we can in the chat there. You're welcome to unmute your microphone. I think I've muted everybody, and please, if you do have any, please keep yourself on mute if you can. It gets distracting if there's background noise. So I think if you do have a question throughout the presentation, we'd like to have some dialogue with all of you if we can manage that with the large group that we have. So please feel free to use the raise hand feature that's also at the top of your screen, and that way we know that you have a question if you don't want to put it in the chat. Yeah, so let's see. We'll introduce our team here who will be doing this presentation with all of you. And so my name is Russell Koff. We're all part of the Cadmus Jacobs team that's supporting FEMA and TEMA with this effort. And myself, Zach, and Anna will be presenting the budget session for you today. We're all part of Jacobs's infrastructure funding and grants team. So we're full-time consultants that work with communities large and small across the country day in and day out to strategize on federal and non-federal grant opportunities, and then to deliver grant applications, benefit cost analyses, and things like that. So really happy to be with you today. I'm based in Denver, Colorado, and yeah, we'll talk about our Tennessee sessions here in a minute, but had the opportunity to meet a number of you in person in our workshops in Memphis, Nashville, Knoxville over the past few weeks and months. Zach, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Zach Zielman. So Russell already did the basic introduction, but I'm the talking head over here. I did attend some of the grant training sessions in person in Western and Central Tennessee. So hopefully there's some familiar faces, and I'm based in San Diego. Anna?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I work with Russell and Zach. I am based in New Hampshire, and then I attended the Nashville and Knoxville and Johnsonville workshops. So looking forward to presenting and helping everyone.
All right. Well, thanks. We would like to get some information from the group, and what we have in mind here is this poll. So let's see. What we'd like you to do is if you can click, I don't think you're able to click onto that link there, but I'll put here in the chat um, this link to menti.com, and we're going to just step through a few questions to find out which organization you're from and any experience you've had with budgeting. So I think Ray from our team, if you're on, do you want to share the presentation here? And yeah, if you can, yeah, please click on this link and we'll see, we'll step through that. So go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, I'm gonna take over the screen. If you could just stop sharing for 1 second. I will share my screen. For those of you unfamiliar with Mentimeter, it's a great way to get audience participation. It's very simple, easy to use. I hope everybody was able to scan that QR code as it showed up. If not, you can see it here on the bottom left of my screen as I go through this Mentimeter presentation. We're going to spend probably about 30 seconds to a minute on each question, and there's only only about 5 questions, so it won't take up too much of your time. Just give this one more second. If you can't scan this with your cell phone, then please go to menti.com and type in this code.
Or the link in the chat will work.
Yes,
too.
Link in the chat as well. So just give everybody 1 second here. I am going to move on, and if you are unable to join, please use the link in the chat momentarily. Okay, so the first question here, just to give us an idea of who is represented here and how we should focus our conversation, is what organization do you represent? So please feel free to type in your response and hit submit. We'll give this about 30 seconds. Okay. So a lot of county organizations, public assistance, TEMA. Excellent. Okay, so it looks like we have a pretty good mix of people here. The next question is, what type of project are you looking to advance with grant funding? You can choose multiple options if you would like, and this will also give us a clearer idea as we move forward with these sessions on what to focus on with our conversations. Okay, so a lot of emergency management, community development. It's a bit like a horse race here. Okay, so as we expected, a pretty good mix of everybody. Everything here is represented. If you did choose other, please feel free to type in the chat in Microsoft Teams what you mean by that, and we'll be sure to note it. And then the next question is, what is your level of experience with grant application budgeting? The team here are obviously all experts, but in order to frame the conversation, we want to make sure that we meet you at your level of knowledge. Okay, so overwhelmingly novice and intermediate. We do have some experts here. If you're an expert, don't worry, there's still plenty to glean from our presentation here today, but we'll definitely keep this in mind moving forward. And are there any specific budget questions that you would like answered today? Any kind of specific questions that you want the team to address? I'll give this another minute since you do have to type out a whole sentence here. So maybe Zach or Anna, if you could just make a note of what to talk about a little bit later on based on these responses, that'd be great. Thank you. Fair, Doug, fair. Many different grants. Okay, so in-kind matches, budgeting government grants, indirect costs, negotiated indirect, Microsoft Excel, sufficient. Okay, so thank you for getting your questions in here. I'll just give this one more second for anybody who's still typing.
Well, good. No, these are great questions. I think we'll touch on many of these in the presentation, and Ray, maybe you can leave it open as we go back to Zach's slides just to capture more here that we can.
Sure.
Can,
okay.
Can
I will stop
offline.
sharing and Zach, take back over here.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Ray. Thanks, everybody. It's good to know kind of who's in the group, and it's great that we have a large group that's probably too large for everyone to go around and introduce themselves on the phone, but we'll dive in today, and good to know that we've got great representation across just different types of organizations and interest in the grant budgeting process. So yeah, I think on the next slide here, yeah, we've you know, as many of you know, we've been working across the state since December, meeting in person with many of you and partners across the state to focus on grants and provide grant trainings. And really the reason that we're doing that is, as some of you heard in our in-person workshops, this is an initiative from FEMA and TEMA really looking to provide communities with more support after disasters strike. And so FEMA and TEMA do a great job rebuilding communities and providing your resources around rebuilding, but we know that the needs don't end there. And so as we experience kind of more and more disasters that have more costs and limited resources from FEMA, really the goal here is to equip all of you with the knowledge and the experience and confidence to pursue as broad of funding opportunities as possible to achieve your community's goals. And so that's why we have been meeting individually and developing our grant content. And on the next slide, yeah, for those of you who don't know, we've started out in Memphis in December, went to Columbia and Nashville towards the end of January, Cookeville and Chattanooga, and then Knoxville and Johnson City just a few weeks ago in late February. Yeah, meeting with you and really doing kind of a comprehensive grant training where we touched on researching grants, how to share your project, or excuse me, how to develop your project and then put in a really competitive grant application. But we really just scratched the surface on all of those presentations. And so going forward, we're going to be delivering a series of digital workshops. And this is the first one here, really focusing on grant budgeting. So with that, just to kind of set the stage of why we're talking about grant budgeting. Well, for one, it's a very hard part of putting together a grant application that involves a lot of challenges with math and complying with federal or non-federal guidance from grant programs. So I think that speaks to kind of the interest that we have from this group in understanding budgets. But I think kind of to a bigger picture, we all want to get to this picture here, right, where we're putting shovels in the ground and creating projects that are serving our communities. And the grant application and the grant budget in particular is just a really important step along the way. And so some of the points I want to make here on the importance of grant budgeting is that yeah, for one thing, it's very important. Like any element of your application, funders will scrutinize grant budgets very closely and look at your costs. And often budgets cannot be changed after you submit your grant application. So many of the grant programs that our team works on, if you have a small change in your project scope or some of your partners, many funders are willing to accommodate that after giving you a grant award. But if your costs go up or your budget's not correct, it can really sink a project that may have received a grant award. And so it's just really important to get that right from the beginning. And really having a good budget, it not only kind of checks the box on your application and make sure that you're complying with the rules, but it really gives funders confidence that the rest of your application is strong as well. So having kind of a clean, compliant budget, it really serves a purpose more than just articulating the cost of your project, but shows a funder that, you've really thought this through and that you're going to be a good partner going forward with on delivering the project. And then finally on this slide, just to make the point that, budgeting it's not always fun to some people, but it really does help applicants to understand your projects, your priorities, and your partners. So there can be a lot of frustration kind of thinking through some of these concepts that I just saw on the poll that people put in about, in-kind support and fringe benefits and things like that. And yeah, it can be frustrating and challenging to articulate those concepts, but I do think that having a good understanding of those really helps you to understand your project and where are the costs going, and is this a project that with a reasonable cost that you as an organization really want to invest in. So there's a number of reasons that budgeting is very important, and we look forward to sharing kind of the nuts and bolts here today. So yeah, with that, I think I'll turn it over to my colleague Zach to go into the first sort of part of our discussion today, and we're really going to try to start at the beginning when you're building your grant project budget, and what do you need to start with. So please keep the questions coming in the chat throughout, and our team will answer all of these. And yeah, take it away, Zach.
All right. Thanks, Russell. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, if any questions come through during this time, feel free to field them my way, or we'll have somebody from the team answer. But really, we want to just get started from building this first section, building your grant project budget, really diving into the weeds on what's needed for building your project budget. First, we'll go over understanding your project costs and what goes into developing the budget, and then looking at a notice of funding opportunity and complying with the grant program requirements, and then what are the budget proposal elements that are required for typical grants, and we'll go over each of those. So first, we'll cover understanding your project costs. It should probably go without saying, you want to be honest and upfront about what is entails what your project costs entail. You want to be detailed and provide as much documentation as possible to come to a logical estimate. So you want to make sure that your budget is comprehensive. There's a number of factors that are important to estimate in your project costs, and I'll cover some of these. And I understand there's a range of folks here, from nonprofits to county and state agencies. So we'll cover different types of projects that might be applicable to you, and various types of grants that you may be applying for from the federal, state, and local level. But this is really, even before getting to that stage, what if you have a project in mind, how you're going to determine the costs that go into it. So generally, just thinking ahead, if you are applying for a grant program, these are going to be your future eligible costs or elements that have not yet been completed. So to understand that, you want to think about the time frame of your project. What stage is it currently at? Are you in pre-construction, or are you looking for funding for construction activities? So where are you currently at, and what activities are you going to be seeking funding for? If you are applying for a grant, there's often a period of performance that's important to think about. Again, just thinking way ahead. If the period of performance, as outlined, we'll go over in the notice of funding opportunities, if that's 36 months, you want to make sure that you're covering all costs associated with it within those 36 months, and understand when you can expect to complete the project and also begin in a reasonably. So when you're thinking about time frame, you'll also want to account for any contingency cost overruns that may be associated with inflation or just things taking longer than expected. So that's all kind of incorporated into time frame. Then we also want to think about a little backwards here, personnel and labor. So who's actually going to be working on the project? If you're at a municipality or a state, or even a nonprofit, you all have maybe a labor rate for individuals. So who's going to be working on it? Do they have individual rates, and how many hours are you going to expect that they're going to need to work on each task? And some grant programs will also require you to incorporate any fringe benefits as in addition to those labor rates. Then there's also materials and equipment. So you'll want to identify that if you're doing a construction project, as you know, many of us, even if you're starting out in the planning phase, you'll be looking to do construction at some point. So you want to know the type of material and equipment that are required, the unit cost, and the quantity that will give you, so when combined, your total cost. And for equipment, if it's a rental or purchase. Other items to consider are any travel requirements, whether it's going to a site, doing those site visits. And some grants will also require you to travel to meet with the grantors. Then any contracts and subawards, as well as project management costs. If you are further along in developing your project, perhaps you've already discussed with a contractor what and gotten an estimate of your project costs. Perhaps they need to be updated or add contingency if you're looking at starting your project a little further down the line. But if a cost estimate has not been previously developed, it's worth just reaching out to some local contractors for an estimate. And I think that's also important to say that it should be local contractors who kind of understand what's going on in the region and what those factors may be that impact costs. So we'll just quickly go into an example project. So you can kind of get an idea and a feel of some of the elements that might be required when just thinking about what project costs would go into this. So an example, maybe a city wants to construct a 2-mile multi-use greenway path that allows people to walk and bike to their destinations, get off of a major road that where accidents occur, and also incorporates some vegetation and stormwater features. We expect it to take a year to include design, permitting, and procuring a contractor, and 2 years to construct. So that's just an example, maybe if you're from a city or county that maybe a project you'd be familiar with. So we'll go over sort of a budget summary. These are numbers made up, maybe not realistic for that actual type of project, but just to go through what might be included. So let's say you need to include community engagement to get feedback from the public. Maybe you didn't originally account for this, but something that a lot of grant programs look for. So these could be personnel or contractor costs.
Zach, you're muted.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks. Okay, so let's say, if you want to include community engagement, as many grant programs do require, this could be personnel or contractor costs, depending on how you set it up. So a contractor might have a lump sum. If you're using your own in-house staff, you want to think about the number of hours and their hourly rates, the number of sessions that are going to be required, and any materials. Then say we have design, so that may be a contractor. You want to consider that, and they'll have perhaps a lump sum cost, but you'll want to consider the time that it takes to get through the milestones required. So if you're at the very beginning, you got your 30, 60, 90% and final design. So obviously takes quite a good amount of time to get through. Then permitting and environmental review. Again, this could be a mix of personnel and contractors. Permitting and environmental review can be a lengthy process in some places, but it can often be done concurrently with the final design. So you want to think about that time frame, where there can be, where it may overlap with other tasks and certain redundancies, but also the elements that go into each of these tasks, like preparing the permits and coordinating with regulatory agencies. Procurement is one that may be a lesser cost, but it is important to think about that you may have personnel time you have to devote to this in preparing RFPs, doing interviews. So again, personnel hours and hourly rates are important to include. And then finally, you get to construction. So generally, these are going to be your contractor costs, maybe some personnel time, depending on how you set it up. Maybe you have a design build or design bid build process. So you might have different contractors from when you do your design versus your construction. But you should have a detailed and documented list of your materials and equipment from your contractor, and make sure it corresponds to the area in which you're doing the work and the length of time needed to complete your project. You don't want to run out of materials or time when you're in a grant agreement. So make sure it is sufficiently budgeted and scheduled to have everything you need to complete within budget. So again, these are just some examples of things to think about. Other considerations that maybe we didn't include in there, but it could be important for your project are the planning and project development part of the phases of the project. And project management and construction oversight are also, they can be line items in your budget as well. So as you're estimating your project costs, determine if any of them can be covered by your agency or a nonprofit. If you're a nonprofit in your budget, that could be a capital improvement program or annual budget, certain funds that have set asides, or if there is another grant that will cover the early stages versus the later stages of a project. So that will make the project move a little bit faster and show that you have that previous experience with grants plus other sources of funding, which can be really important to show in some cases. So now that we've kind of gone through an example of and how to project your project costs, we'll go through some grant program requirements and looking at the notices of funding opportunities for grant programs. So we'll start off with the federal notice of funding opportunity. These are often much more complex, have a lot more requirements than even your state or foundation grant programs, but we'll touch on those as well. If anybody has applied for a federal grant, you know that they release these notices of funding opportunities, and they can be quite dense, but you'll get a lot of important information out of these. And this is just kind of backing up, back to our in-person sessions. We gave a lot of background information. So you might remember this, but it's important as you get into the budget to know how to read these and where to find the important information. Obviously, it provides your program description, the eligibility information, so who can apply and for what types of projects, and how you're going to submit. That will also include, what types of documentation is required when you do submit your application. But also importantly for the budget, how much you can request and your cost share requirements that we'll get into. So don't be intimidated by this. There is, a lot of information, but it's important to kind of go through and highlight what the requirements are. So yeah, this is kind of from the Federal Register. They don't all look like this, but this is one example. So next, we also show a nonprofit or a foundation grant program. So these are usually a little bit more friendly for readers. Again, they'll go through your eligibility requirements and the application submission process, and often provide various resources for you. So just check the NOFO requirements, get familiar with the goals of the grant program and any submission application requirements. if you need to include a budget narrative and a budget table, as well as any forms or some combination of those, that will be listed in the NOFO. Okay, so now we'll kind of step through an example of a notice of funding opportunity and some of the information to pull out of those. Okay, so here's, again, a federal one. We'll use these kind of as examples, again, because they are often the most stringent in terms of requirements, often the most dense. So it's good if you can get familiar with these. You should be set with all sorts of grant programs. This happens to be a NOFO for a culvert aquatic organism passage program from the Federal Highway Administration. So it will tell you, the fiscal years in which it is available. You want to, again, ensure that your costs are going to be eligible. So that's where you'll determine whether your costs are eligible, your activities that you want to complete. And also ensure that the funding can be expended within the period of performance. So if it tells you you're not going to be able to receive your funds before October 1st, 2025, you want to make sure that your project and what you're requesting funding for does not begin before that. And also, when you can expect to complete your project or the period of performance. So again, if it says 36 months, you want to make sure that anything that you're requesting funding for falls within that time frame. Also identify how much you can request. So for this particular one, there is no minimum or maximum grant size, but they do provide a range from 200,000 to 50 million. So you don't want to necessarily, you can, but you don't want to go over that 50 million if you don't have to, just to be more competitive. And then also there are cost share requirements on the bottom left that is indicating that you can't have more than 80% of your funds coming from federal sources. So the additional 20% would need to come from elsewhere, a state or a local match. Other information you want to be able to pull from the NOFO, again, the documents that will be required for submission. So that's often a budget table and a budget narrative, and we'll go over each of those in a little bit. Elements required in the budget. So you'll want to show the categories from which your funding is coming from, the different sources rather. So that could be your federal, non-federal, what you're requesting from the current application and your matching funds, and anything else that they may want you to talk about in your budget narrative. It will also describe how to include contingency if they do want to see that, in fact. Sometimes, depending on whether it's federal, state, or the grantor, they'll want you to include contingency just built into your costs. So, if you've got $100,000 task, you might want to just include that contingency built in and say it's $110,000. Other times they'll want you to actually break it out either as a total or by task and by item. So you'll find how they want you to do that in the NOFO. Just make sure that you're budgeting a sufficient amount of contingency. All right. And next, we'll cover how to actually prepare your budget proposal and the elements that go within it. So provide as much documentation as possible. Gather all the materials you can as you start to do this process. You want to give them as much information and evidence as they request, even a little bit more if you can. Provide documentation of your funding sources. So if you're providing a match, say 20% of the project cost, you'll want to provide a match commitment letter that is a signed letter indicating, where that funding is coming from and that you are committed to providing it throughout the course of the project period of performance. Any other funding sources, you'll also want to provide information about those. If you've received previous grants, other awards, then you want to make sure that you're providing any documentation about where that's coming from and that it has been obligated to your project. And other deliverables that are often required are the budget table and budget narrative. And for federal grants, the standard forms. And so we'll go over each of those. So just want to also indicate that a grantor does reserve the right, after an application is selected for an award, to request additional supporting information or documentation for purposes of confirming that the costs are allowable. And just want to touch on some best practices for budgeting. You want to, generally across the board in all cases, whether you're applying for a foundation or a state grant or federal, include items in the budget that are eligible, which are permitted by the NOFO guidance, reasonable, and so when possible, providing detailed cost estimates, allocable, incurred either directly or indirectly as part of the project, and necessary, that they're essential for meeting the project goals. And your funding requests and cost share should meet the minimum or maximum specified in the NOFO. So you want to look for those keywords that you're not requesting more than the maximum award amount, and also providing either the minimum, essentially the minimum cost share requirement. Okay, so the first place to start, everybody is going to have to provide an application project narrative, regardless of what type of grant you're applying for. So this is a good place and often where you start discussing the budget. So the narrative should very briefly talk about how much funding is requested, the local match that you'll provide, as well as the total project cost. That's often stated right in the very introductory paragraph. Sometimes there is a budget section within the project narrative. So that's important to just include very briefly. You'll also want to be clear about how the grant money will be spent and how it's going to benefit your community, and be directly tied to your project, and that it's reasonable to complete the project. And the project narrative is different than the budget narrative, so we'll touch on that in a little bit as well. But within the project narrative, this is where you're also describing what you're doing in the project, your scope of work, your community benefits and all that. This is just one small section, usually about a half a page in length. And it will accompany the other information in the budget table and budget narrative. Another element that I mentioned that is often important to provide if you are providing a match or cost share is a commitment letter. So here's just an example. In this very short letter, again, this is signed by city manager or city engineer or whoever at your organization that is responsible for overseeing your funds. You want to provide the total dollar amount or percentage of the match as it relates to the total project cost. You want to define what the source of the funding is and also align it with the requirements in the NOFO. So if the NOFO says you need to provide 25% as a match, then just clearly state that in the letter so that the grantor can review it, make sure that it checks the boxes. All right, so probably the most common element when providing a budget is the budget table. And this can be, often it can be done in an Excel format. I know that was a question that came up. Sometimes there are specific forms that you'll need to fill out. It may be an online web form that they just want you to fill in the dollar amounts, but often you can provide an Excel format of your budget that kind of outlines how the costs were estimated. The budget tables, again, may look a little bit different based on the funding program, but you want to detail the plans for covering the full cost of the project from all sources. This one here is just showing federal share versus non-federal share, but also breaks it down by each task and subtask. So this one had a percentage that was required to be non-federal share. So this clearly outlines how much was non-federal share for each task and to meet that requirement. So in some cases, you'll want to show that how those different funding sources will share in each activity, and also identify any other federal funds if you're applying for a federal grant that you're applying for that have been awarded or that you intend to use. That could also be the case for any other type of program as well. It doesn't have to be a federal grant. You may, if you have other awards that you have been awarded or intend to use, you'll also want to indicate those. Okay, again, just touching on identifying different funding sources within your budget table. So for this particular one, it's a design and construction project. So they've got the total estimate, the amount that they're applying for. So they wrote out RAISE grant, which is no longer RAISE, but at the time. And then the county share would be how much the applicant would be providing, which in this case was none for this particular phase. And then other sources of funding. And then they also went a little bit more detailed in terms of how much was previously expended and provided that information for both what the applicant themselves provided as well as other sources. So always make sure that you are indicating any previous awards to the project in the past or for which the project intends to apply for in the future. For each category of federal funds to be used for future eligible project costs, the budget should include the amount, the nature, and source of any required non-federal match. And here's some more examples on just giving you a sense of the level of detail of some of these budgets. So this first one is a little bit more bare bones, just provides the federal, local, and total. You'll again want to make sure you're just meeting the requirements or the ask from the NOFO. The second one gives actually some more description about each task and shows what is going to be expended in each year of the project. So year 1 through 4, along with the cost share and the project total. And then there's some grants, including those by FEMA, that actually require you to outline how much how much funding is necessary for each particular line item, and you would provide the unit of measure and the cost category as well as the unit price. So various levels of detail.
And Zach, this is Russell. I might come in here to answer Allison's question in the chat, which is a good one about, is there such a thing as including too much information here? And what I would say to that is, in general, no. I think more information is better. However, what we often advise is when you're presenting your budget in your grant application or in the budget section, we think it's better to provide more of a summary in the way that Zach has on the screen here, and then some more detailed information is usually best as an appendix where you can attach maybe a more detailed cost estimate for your project that gets down to the cost of various materials, and if you have different consultant roles on a project, that really gets into that in detail. So yeah, I do think more information is better and shows that your costs are really well thought out and well estimated. But with everything, like with anything in a grant application, it is good to remember that reviewers are reviewing many applications, and kind of presenting the most important elements in kind of a clean way, as we can see on the slide here on the left side, where you have kind of distinct phases of the project that are really easy to understand at a glance, is probably the best way to present it, at least initially, and then those additional details can be included as an appendix or further in the back of the document, let's say. Anything to add to that, Zach?
I wanted to add really quick also, in addition to that, the grant applications themselves typically have page count limits. So you're going to be limited within the application for how much information you can include.
Right. Yeah, those are both great points. Definitely provide as much detail as you can, but anything that is not directly asked for in the grant program NOFO, you can add as an attachment as much as they allow it. If you've got a preliminary design or engineering report for a project that may include some initial estimates that could be the basis of how you're putting together your budget, you might want to include those estimates as an attachment, or if you've pulled estimates from a local contractor, you could provide those as an attachment. And yeah, any supporting just documentation could be either an attachment or appendix, and you'll want to just refer to that in your budget narrative to refer to those documents for more information, but try to summarize it as much as possible, but in a clear way for the reviewers in the required documents. So in your budget narrative or budget table, it should be a summary of like all the detailed information in those attachments. So speaking of, next we'll talk about the budget narrative, which is often another required element of putting together your budget for a grant program. So here's some key things to think about when putting together your budget narrative. And a lot of these will apply across each of these documents. Of course, the budget narrative is just the written portion that accompanies the budget table. So it will often be a lot of the same information, but something that you'll use to elaborate on anything that isn't maybe as clearly conveyed through the table. So again, your sources, uses, and availability of funding. If you've if you have different sources of funding, describe where those are coming from and when they'll be available. If they already are, if it's another grant program that you're relying on, if they've been obligated already, or if you can expect it to be obligated at, within the period of performance that your project will be under, and include any documentations, like if it's a transportation project, if those are included in your local state transportation improvement program, you might include the pages from those. You'll want to also describe the contingency amount and your plan for any potential cost overruns. The contingencies, the requirements may vary by program, so you want to make sure yours aligns with what they're requesting and saying that you can include, but show and describe how you came to that number. Describe the level of design completion if you are at that stage. If there's been no design, you can describe that, but if you're at 30% design in your project, you probably already have some estimate of what the project is going to cost. So you'll describe where you're at and how that estimate was put together at that level, and that it would be revised as you kind of move along. And then how and when and by whom the project costs were estimated. Those are all key things that they'll be looking for. But you'll want to make sure that they're updated and generally no more than a year, older than a year from the deadline of the grant application. Otherwise, you want to make sure that they incorporate any inflation again, and that are relevant for when you expect the project to be under construction or when the grant funds would be expended. And then finally, the cost share or matching funds. You want to show that it satisfies the statutory cost share, that any matching requirements that are shown in your budget table, you describe where those are coming from. And that should also be supplemented with your cost match commitment letter. So here's an example of what a budget narrative may look like. This is just one page of a budget narrative. Often they can be many pages, again, because you're providing as much detail as possible to talk about each task within your project and where the funding is coming from and how you came to those estimates. So again, here's just some elements to consider, how the costs were determined. You want to make sure that's stated up front. Provide a description of any previously incurred costs or other sources of funding that will contribute towards the project. and align the budget to the scope of work, any tasks or activities that you've outlined in your scope of work and the schedule. So here we have, different phases in this particular project, and then the tasks within those phases. So as you're describing your budget, you want to show in which phase and which task they'll be expended. And then if there's anything unusual about the project or expenses that may not come across clearly in the budget table, this would be an opportunity to describe them, so it's upfront for the reviewers, and that they don't come back and question it necessarily, or provide as much information upfront as possible to reduce any delays. And then next we will cover standard forms. So Anna's going to take this. Go ahead, Anna.
Okay. So the first step beyond the budget is that you will be required to complete standard federal forms. These can all be found on grants.gov and downloaded there. So when you go on grants.gov, basically you can click forms, and then the SF 424 individual as well as family forms. There you can download PDFs of these forms. However, when you're in grants.gov itself, you will have the option to complete online forms. We would recommend actually filling those out rather than completing the PDFs and uploading those, just because it's easier for the reviewers. However, ahead of time prior to the submittal, you should complete the PDFs, just because it'll help you complete the application much faster when you're in the portal. And then the other thing you want to remember is that you can start filling these items out ahead of schedule. So prior to even having your narrative complete, you can start completing these forms. And then something else that you want to remember is that the costs that you provide in the budget table, those need to align with the federal forms that you provide. So just real quick, another thing is prior to moving on to this slide, we wanted to ask if anyone has any questions about the prior slides. Just a quick break. If you want to raise your hand or drop a question in the chat. Okay, Douglas?
Yes. Hey, everyone. Just to make it clear, and again, I've been out of the mitigation world for over a year now, so I just want to make sure the grants.gov for everybody, is that something anyone can get into? You were asking about the forms, so you don't have to be part of a state or anyone. Okay, good information. Thank you.
Yeah, if you actually go on grants, like you can open up grants.gov itself anytime, and that's just a public source available. It has all the notices of funding opportunity as well as these standard forms, and you don't have to have an account to log on. What you do need an account for is actually when you're applying for the opportunity, and then that's what takes several weeks to process. But all the resources on grants.gov, like downloading NOFOs or filtering through NOFOs or actually seeing the variety of forms themselves, that's accessible at any time unless the website's down.
And I've just popped that link in the chat if you want to access it. There's a lot of other forms in that repository, but the ones we're talking about here are just the 424 and 424A and 424C forms.
Then any other questions? We'll leave it open for one more minute prior to moving on. Okay. If not, continue dropping questions in the chat and then we'll answer those accordingly. And then we'll also have a question period after the presentation concludes. So basically, in the standard forms themselves, you have the eligible costs, of course. So you can have non-construction or construction activities. So you basically have to complete the SF424 itself, and then you have the SF424A and B, which is for non-construction activities, and then you have the SF424C and D for construction activities. So you want to know which activities and which funding stream you're applying for. So when you're applying for non-construction activities, those consist of, let's say, planning, design, engineering, such items. And then for construction, those typically consist of activities such as site work, demolition, construction. If you are, let's say, applying for some planning activities as well as construction, and the bulk of your work is construction, then you still will complete the C and D, which is for construction activities. So construction itself is the overarching basis. So if you don't have any construction activities, for sure you'll be A and B, which is the non-construction. But if you have construction as well as pre-construction activities, then you're going to go with the construction forms. Next slide. So the SF424 itself, it's a several page application. So it has a variety of questions such as the applicant's info. And then in addition to that, it has the funding allocations. So you want to break out your estimated funding costs by these categories as highlighted on the screen. So basically the federal funding request, the applicant, how much you're providing, and then state, local, other program income, those other breakouts. And this is just buckets in and of themselves. And then in addition to that, you'll also be asked to provide additional information. And then one more thing to note is that the SF424 itself, if you could go back one slide, not all of the questions you'll be actually required to fill out. Some of the questions you can leave blank. So if there's asterisks or if you're in the online form, those will get the actual applicable questions that you have to fill out no matter what. One more thing to note is that the SF424 forms, how you fill them out, this is basically just a check mark in and of itself. So if there's like, let's say a typo in terms of how you write or something, you just want to have your numbers correct, but at the same time, this isn't how your application is being reviewed. The narrative is what affects if you're being funded. This is more of just a checkbox to make sure that everything is correct. If you did make an error, try not to make an error, but if you did make an error, then the agency can reach out to you and ask you to correct the form. Next slide. So the SF424A, this is again for non-construction activities. So basically you have those buckets of funds all combined. So you have, let's say, the federal funds, you have the non-federal funds and such. And right there, basically, if all of your, let's say, if you're only going after one funding stream, then you would break out the costs into just that one row. But let's say you received another federal funding award, then you would also break out and list it there too. Next slide. And then right here, again, this another page of the SF424A, so it goes into more detail and having the breakouts of, let's say, personnel costs, travel costs, equipment, contractual, and such. So one other thing to note is that while the budget within the narrative, it typically aligns with the milestones of your schedule, this budget right here is something that might look a bit different from what you include within the budget narrative. So what we often recommend is if there's a difference in terms of how your budget looks because it's trying to align with the milestones of your schedule, you want to also include a second budget that aligns with this SF424A table or the SF424C table. Next slide. And then right here, you will also be required to, again, list out the different non-federal sources and then keep going. Forecasted needs. So basically you want to break this out by quarter. So what your needs will be dependent on the quarter. And then in the following one, you will be breaking out just by year. So let's say the first year, second year, third year, fourth year. So just in questions 13 to, or items 13 to 15, you'll be breaking out by quarter just for that first year. And then after that, you'll be breaking out actually by year. Another thing to note is that this is again forecasting, right? So let's say the agency awards you $25 million. Your breakouts right here, this is forecasts. When you actually go into that grant obligation, that's what's going to be legally binding. So again, don't worry. You want to have as accurate numbers as possible, but if this isn't final, these breakouts can shift around once you receive that notice of funding award and you sign the grant agreement. Next. And then right here, you can include other budget information, just any notes that you want to include. For example, there was a grant opportunity called the SMART grant opportunity, and we had applicants list out a note about the travel costs, how those were calculated. So just anything that you might think that the reviewers might have questions about, you want to include notes there. Next. And then this is how the SF424C looks. So basically, again, you have the categories, and then you're going to be breaking out in the A column, the total costs, B, the costs that are not allowable for participation. Typically, those remain zero. However, sometimes individuals and applicants do have those filled out. And then C will automatically populate based on what you populated into A and B. Another thing to note is that you want to try to have full dollar amounts. We've seen USDOT, so US Department of Transportation, be picky about pennies. So they've actually had some applicants revise this budget table and have full dollar amounts rather than having cents listed. And then that 80%, you want to make sure it's 80% on the dot. It cannot exceed 80% for the federal agency, unless, of course, the NOFA allows for a greater amount. But typically the agency match is 80%. So if you need like $1 or $2 extra in terms of your local match, you need to make sure that that's aligns perfectly.
Yeah, and just wanted to jump in here for the costs that are not allowable. This is again where you want to refer to the NOFO and any activities or costs that are stated that the grant program will not cover, but you still may have as part of your project, they would go into that category. However, the amount that is being determined as the match is going to be based on only the allowable costs.
And then we're going to dive into advanced budgeting topics. So number one that you want to think about when you're building your budget is the feasibility. So whether all of the information that you provided is sufficient for the reviewer to determine if the project can be carried out feasibly and reasonably within the provided budget. So you don't want to underestimate, and then you also don't want to overestimate, because then that'll make the reviewer question how that budget was built. So if you are capable of providing additional information, then that's optimal. So again, we understand that typically within a grant application, there's page limits. So you won't be able to often provide, let's say, detailed line items stating this row and this row and this row was calculated and these individual salaries were calculated this way. However, as someone, I believe, asked if an Excel budget is sufficient, yes, it typically is. So, but that Excel budget, that can only be included within the appendix. Within the narrative application itself, if you have 100 line items that went into that Excel, you won't be able to include that just because of page limits. So you want to make sure that you basically explain that. You mentioned that you have an Excel spreadsheet that has been provided in the appendices that goes into more detail, but you also want to provide at least some narrative information that explains this, that everything was built with feasibility, and make sure that the reviewer understands that somebody with expertise built this budget. And then another thing to note is that you want to also demonstrate if there was any previous awards or project funding, and then if those were awarded, then you want to also indicate how everything was complete, and then overall, if that was complete on time, within budget. If you were under budget, that's okay. It's you don't want to have examples of going over budget. So of course, if you were under budget, that's okay, because just then that means whatever was unspent is unspent. However, if you went over budget, that does raise concerns whether that project will actually be feasible, and the readiness of that budget itself. Next. So typically, for, let's say, FEMA grants, you can request up to 5% of management costs to be covered. It again varies by agency. So management costs include typically staff costs, and within those, you want to include the number of hours, hourly rate, such items. And right here, as can be seen in this chart, there's detailed numbers. So you want to provide as much detail as you're able to. And then again, you want to build in to make sure that you build in, let's say, salary increases, such things like that. Because again, those funds that you receive aren't going to be immediate. So we understand that you want to ensure that inflation, all those things are built in, and then of course raises.
And
Next.
yeah, and there also are other grant programs, non-FEMA grant programs that will cover staff costs for putting together applications for a grant program, and sort of that pre-award costs. I think there was a question about that. However, I think it's more uncommon than not. So, but just to be aware, there are other programs besides FEMA that offer that.
And then we have also seen very rarely, but there are some NOFOs that actually cover the grant application development, well, to a certain extent, such as the Transit Security Grant Program. If an applicant is awarded funding, then they'll cover a proportion. There's a dollar amount that's specified of the grant writing costs. Douglas?
Yes, hi. Those are good points. Thank you. Those are very good points. One other thing I wanted to throw out there, especially when we're talking about federal grants, and this has happened, I've seen this happen with us a few times, something called DOB, duplication of benefits. So you want to be careful with the staff or the person that you have, people you have working on these projects. You can't have federal funds duplicated. And what I mean by that is you have somebody that's getting paid with federal cost, you can't ask for more management costs. So you got to be aware of that. And we've had that happen in Tennessee several times. So there's things called EMPG and other funding sources. So you want to be aware of that with some of the federal costs or federal grants. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very good point.
Next slide. Another topic that we want to go over is scaling projects. So this is recommended when you have a significant project budget. And if you think potentially, let's say that you might not be able to receive all of the funds, then you want to, and you are willing to, and think that the project can be delivered with a reduced amount, we encourage an applicant to identify a scale. So let's say that the grant is for equipment needs. So you need, I don't know, 20 harbor cranes. And if you think that some of the NOFO goals and the project goals can be achieved with, let's say, 10, you want to identify scaled funding options so that the agency can provide you with a portion of the funds to meet a phase. But however, again, it's not guaranteed when you do scaling how much that the agency will provide funding for. And then, of course, one other thing to note is you want to provide a minimum funding amount that will make the project work. Next slide. So for phase projects, typically that means you go through, you identify different stages. So for example, let's say design stage, construction stage. So you want to identify the costs in terms of those stages of the project. So let's say you complete the planning activities, and then you complete the design activities and then the construction activities. So basically breaking out the costs in terms of those different buckets. And then you also want to state what the deliverables will be if each phase is met. Okay, next slide. And then right here is an example of phasing. So basically the applicant developed a master plan for almost 30 years, and the applicant had different phases of the project that would make the whole master plan work. So basically what they did is the phases, they called them spokes, and they sought funding for each different phase. So let's say one phase, they identified the time period to meet a specific portion of their goals, and then they had a second phase, and then a third phase, and then so on. And with each phase, they sought different funding opportunities. So this is basically if you have, let's say, a huge project, if at least some of those project goals can be met, then you want to seek different funding opportunities and meet those different phases so that you're continuously working through and building and completing and receiving funding. So that way also the project at least is being complete slowly over time. Next slide. Another thing that you can do is bundle projects. So this is an example of a winning project in LA County. So they had different projects throughout the county in different cities. So they had active transportation projects, which was like bike lanes. They had rail improvements. They had bus lanes, just a variety of projects all over the county. And those were non-contiguous. However, they were able to make an argument for how all of these projects fit together into one vision and receive funding for, it was about $139 million. So bundling projects, sometimes it works out, sometimes it does not. We typically don't recommend doing that unless an applicant is able to make a very strong persuasive argument in terms of how this bundled project, because it is non-contiguous, how it actually connects into one vision and why the applicant isn't seeking funding for, let's say, just specific portions. Another risk that is run when projects are bundled is that, again, only portions of that bundle will be funded for. So that's where you bring up scaling, because the agency might decide to only award funds for certain projects, looking at the benefits of what those projects are. So it's basically you walk a fine line in terms of if you mention the benefits, say let's for one portion, and then let's say the benefits for another project are far less, you run that risk of, well, the agency might look to only fund the highest benefit projects within that bundle and not fund the low benefit areas. Okay, next slide. So there's multiple components of bundling projects, right? So you want to make sure everything is delineated in case that the agency does award partial funding. So you want to make sure that everything, when you build that budget, that you have that breakout. So let's say on one street you have this one project, on another street you have a different project. You want to have that delineated so that the agency can easily identify if they want to fund partially, then they're able to do that. And then, of course, you want to have sufficient details. So you want to have those backup costs. You don't want to just say, let's say all of the labor costs are this amount. You want to be able to exhibit within that Excel spreadsheet that, okay, this is the labor, this is how it was calculated, this was the rates, everything like that. Okay. Another topic we'll go over is the personnel fringe costs. So this is basically calculated by multiplying the personnel cost as well as the lead applicant's fringe benefit rate. So here we give an example of, let's say, $100,000 salary multiplied by 22%. That'll give you $22,000. And then this should include all workforce expenses, so such as health insurance and things like that. Risk management and contingency. So for contingency, we typically recommend that applicants build in or include a separate line item for the contingency, and that contingency again will make sure that you have sufficient budget to cover for inflation growth, things like that. Typically it's 20%. However, of course, you can have a higher or lower amount. For FEMA applications, typically you build that contingency in within the different line items. For some agencies, such as USDOT, they'll actually have a separate line item that you just have your overall contingency for your project. And then another thing you want to do is identify risk management measures. So you want to explain how you've sufficiently budgeted for delays, scope changes, such items. So again, your budget should be very much sufficient for covering anything that might go wrong. If you want to have run a risk of having a higher budget and then underspend rather than underestimating, and then you're looking for funds, because when you're awarded, let's say $20 million and you realize, oh, several years down the line, things took longer than expected. And if you don't have sufficient money to complete the project, that's going to be on you, the applicant, to find those additional funds. The agency isn't going to provide additional funds. So again, better to overestimate than underestimate. Next slide.
And make sure the contingency is incorporated into the budget tables, but for the risk management, you'll want to describe that within the budget narrative. So include the calculations in the table, but any additional clarification should go into the narrative.
And then another thing to note is that there's always federal requirements that the budget needs to be compliant with. Read the notice of funding opportunity, as these are always changing. So for example, there is the Build America, Buy America requirement. Then you might have prevailing wage requirements. Another thing you might have is, let's say, foreign countries of concern. So the Clean Ports Notice of Funding Opportunity, for example, had a list of countries from which equipment could not be provided or expected to be provided from. So these are just little subtle items that you want to read through that Notice of Funding Opportunity from and make sure that you're able to address all those little requirements. Next slide. So any questions regarding that section real quick? If not, I'll pass it on to Russell.
Great, thanks, Anna. Let's see. So that's really the content that we've prepared for everybody today. I know we covered quite a lot of ground on all aspects of budgeting. So would welcome any questions if folks want to raise their hand.
Maybe, Russell, it would be a good time to go over the questions that were asked in the Mentimeter and answer those live. Maybe people could speak up if they wrote those.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the list here.
Okay, sorry, you have the list, or do you want to share the screen?
Yeah, well, let's see. No, I don't think we'll share the screen. We got a lot of really good questions, and I think we've addressed a number of these about the Excel question Anna mentioned. There is one here on negotiating indirect costs, and I think we touched on that today. Indirect costs are those that that cost that your organization bears that's not tied directly to a particular grant project. And the rules about what whether indirect costs can be an eligible cost under your grant. It depends based on the program. So some grant programs will not allow for indirect costs and others will. And it is a complex area of budgeting because there's various ways that you can determine what your indirect cost rate is. And for many federal grants, they will allow you either to submit your own indirect cost rate that has to be kind of an audited cost, and you provide justification for how that indirect cost rate was arrived at. Or if you don't want to do that, they allow you to do a what they call a de minimis indirect cost rate, which is 10%. So if there's a more specific question on that, it is a tricky area. It depends on the grant program. We can follow up with whoever asked that question too, if there's something specific that'd be best to be shared afterwards. But yeah. I'm looking here. What else? Oh, in-kind matches, and how those work. So for in-kind matches, and that means that, if your organization and if the grant program requires you to provide a a matching contribution. So let's say the grant program will pay for 75% of the grant project and requires the applicant to contribute the remaining 25%. The grant program might stipulate whether that needs to be a cash match, where basically you'd provide the monetary value of that 25%, or the alternative would be an in-kind match. And so in-kind match can be things like the time of staff at your organization. So if someone at your organization is going to be dedicated to that project, either managing it or delivering some of the activities that might be funded, then you can quantify the value of that person's time as their in-kind contribution. With larger infrastructure projects, we often see in-kind as take the form of land donations often, or sometimes equipment. But if it's a vertical construction project, an applicant might provide, the land where a building sits, because that's really an eligible cost. It's essential to have the land and maybe purchase the land if you're going to develop a construction project. So if an applicant already has that land, then they can value that land as their in-kind match towards the project. And we do get questions from time to time about what sort of documentation you need for the value of an in-kind match. And again, it does vary depending on the program. For some federal agencies like Department of Transportation, they're honestly pretty flexible and will likely concur with the applicant's assessment of the value of land, and you don't need to have a terribly detailed or expensive assessment of the land. Same with equipment, but other federal agencies might have more requirements about that. And so I see Twana's question here: what would be an example of an in-kind match if you're creating a new professional position? Well, that one might be a little bit tricky. And so if that's the only activity of your grant project, I think it could be difficult to come up with what that in-kind contribution would be for a grant project to request funding to hire a new person. I think in that scenario, you would have indirect costs, and depending on the grant program, you might be able to use those indirect costs as some sort of in-kind match, but it would depend on that particular program. I think one strategy you could explore as well is to kind of broaden the scope of your project. So maybe instead of just defining the project as hiring a new professional position, and again, so long as the grant program allows you to request funding for other activities or eligible expenses, if you were going to scope your project so that you're requesting funding to host events that this new professional position would coordinate and facilitate, then your in-kind match could be maybe the space where those events take place. If your organization has that space and rents it out periodically, then you can value that the cost of that in your proposal, and structure it so that your grant proposal would request X amount of funding, and your local match would go towards the space or some other activities that you do have the ability to provide as an in-kind contribution. Let me know if that makes sense. Okay. Office space. Yeah, I think I would want to learn a little more about the grant program and the project. Tawana, to be able to answer that confidently. You're welcome to come off mute if you like, or we can, okay, or we can, yeah, we happy to connect afterwards. I think we have your email here from the invite. And let's see, another question from our list. Oh, go ahead, Anna.
Oh, I was gonna say another question, but you can do your question first.
No, go for it.
Okay. I was gonna go over, well, the anticipate how to anticipate actual dollars needed with fluctuations in pricing situations, other funding. I think that's just basically building in that contingency. So having an amount that you're comfortable with escalation and costs. So again, that 20%, but maybe we've seen higher amounts. I think we saw one time as high as 40% just because the level of design wasn't very highly complete, and then also because the applicant was expecting high shipment costs. So if you're unsure of the costs, you want to mark that and explain why the contingency is so high. But another thing to note there is that typically projects with higher level of design, when you're seeking, let's say, construction funds, those will be looked at more favorably just because the budget seems more solid. But again, if you're seeking funds for, let's say, planning or design activities, then that's totally okay for that to be less sure.
Okay. Let's see, Anna, any other questions you're seeing on this list?
I remembered something else I wanted to bring up is that something that is good to mention is that you want to mention that the budget was built by somebody that's reputable. So we often recommend saying like, oh, okay, this consultant with this amount of experience built the budget, or let's say if it was an internal agency person, then you want to specify that they've been building budgets for, let's say, a decade or 2 decades, I don't know. And then you could even include their resume as an appendix item.
Linda, I see your question here. How do you know how much to ask for if there is no amount quoted? I'm wondering if you want to come off of mute and just explain. I just want to make sure I understand. What do you mean if there's no amount quoted?
I was asked to write a grant through Mountain Ways. I'm working with the Tennessee Baptist Disaster Response, and we're building roads and bridges in Upper East Tennessee. And they asked me to write a grant proposal. So they did not give me parameters on how much to ask for. How do you know when it's too much or too little?
So they're just looking for as much funding as possible to reconstruct as many roads as they can. Is that right?
We are, yes.
Okay.
So I wrote the grant. They're deciding the board's meeting today, so I'm praying for good results. But how do you know futuristically when you've insulted them by asking for too much, or you cut yourself short by not asking for enough?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I think well, there's a few things that come to mind for me. If it is a grant program where you're able to do some research and figure out what the value of most awards typically are, or what they've given out to other organizations in the past. No.
No, I didn't have access to that.
Okay. Well, the other suggestion I'd have then is, yeah, really as much specific information that you can provide about project costs, I think would be helpful so that the funders know that, even if your request is so much larger than they had in mind, at least they can see very clearly that, with this funding, you want to reconstruct a dozen bridges and it's not for two bridges, let's say. And I think that can help them to say, or to decide that, well, maybe they don't have the funding to give you the entire grant, but they know that if they give you half of the amount, then, you'll still put that funding to good use. You think that strategy would work here?
Well, let's hope so.
We'll see. Yeah. Okay. Well, good luck to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And you may also want to show how you've prioritized your projects. If you have some documentation, like if it was in a plan, for instance, transportation improvement program, maybe some of the projects were listed first as priorities versus some others, or if there has been an assessment done of your roads and bridges, like which ones have met a certain criteria where they really need to get this funding to be reconstructed. Otherwise, they're unusable. That could be supporting information that goes into your narrative or as an attachment that kind of backs up the need for all of this money, or again, showing that it can be kind of scaled in some way. So if you don't get all of it, you're still willing to accept and work with a certain kind of percentage.
Okay, I did an Excel spreadsheet of the cost that we spend for wood, for live bolts, for concrete. So I broke it down each item. So hopefully, and I gave them a set number of bridges and roads that we can physically do in a year. We'll see. But thank you for your guidance.
Thanks for the question.
Okay. I think we've covered all the questions from at the top of the presentation. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat here. We'll stick around for another few minutes if there are other questions. But thank you very much to everybody for attending today. And we will send out these presentation slides to each of you, so you'll have them for reference later on. And please feel free to contact any of us by email if questions come up afterwards. And I think we'll also be following up with just a question or two by email on just feedback on this session, and would love any input that you all can provide. So yeah, thank you again for participating. I'm glad we had a good group. And then, I should flag too that we have 2 more sessions. I think everyone's received the invites to these. Next week, we have a session on Tuesday focused on really diving into grant writing And then on Thursday, we have a session really looking at identifying grant opportunities across multiple sectors. And we have other digital sessions to follow through this month. So would welcome all of you to join in on those, and you'll get the invites for those if you haven't already. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.